At 7:02 on the morning of December 7, 1941, Private Joseph Lockard sat in front of a radar oscilloscope screen inside a tent on Opana Point, the northernmost tip of Oahu, Hawaii, and watched something that shouldn't exist. The green phosphorescent screen showed a massive return signal, the largest he had ever seen in the 3 months he'd been operating the Army's experimental SE-270 mobile radar station. The signal indicated a formation of aircraft, multiple aircraft, more aircraft than he'd ever tracked on radar, approximately 50 miles north of Oahu and heading directly toward the island at high speed. Lockard called to his partner, Private George Elliott, who was preparing to shut down the radar station because their shift had officially ended at 7 in the morning. "George, come look at this," Lockard said. "I've got a contact that doesn't make sense." Elliott walked over and stared at the oscilloscope. The signal was enormous, filling nearly the entire bottom portion of the screen, representing what had to be at least 50 aircraft, possibly more. "That can't be right," Elliott said. "There's no formation that large anywhere near Hawaii. Maybe the equipment is malfunctioning." Lockard checked the radar settings, adjusted the gain control, verified the antenna rotation. Everything was functioning normally. The signal was real. He picked up the telephone that connected directly to the Army's information center at Fort Shafter, the command post responsible for coordinating air defense of Oahu, and called in the contact. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered, a private named Joseph McDonald who was manning the information center alone because most of the staff had gone to breakfast. "Information center," McDonald said. "This is Opana Point," Lockard replied. "We have a large formation of aircraft inbound from the north, distance approximately 50 miles, bearing 0 degrees 3 minutes, looks like 50-plus aircraft." McDonald's response was immediate confusion. "Wait, 50 aircraft? Are you sure your equipment is working correctly?" "Positive," Lockard said. "This is the largest signal I've ever seen. It's definitely multiple aircraft, definitely heading toward Oahu." McDonald didn't know what to do with this information. He was trained to answer phones and relay messages, not make tactical decisions about unidentified aircraft approaching Hawaii. "Hold on," he said. "I need to find an officer." Lockard waited, watching the signal on his oscilloscope screen continue to approach. The formation was now approximately 47 miles out, still heading directly toward Oahu, still maintaining course and speed. After 3 minutes, a different voice came on the line. "This is Lieutenant Kermit Tyler. What's the situation?" Lieutenant Tyler was the duty officer at the information center, a 28-year-old pilot who had been assigned to the information center for exactly 1 week to learn about air defense coordination. He had no training in radar operations, no experience interpreting radar contacts, and no clear understanding of what Lockard was telling him. "Sir, this is Private Lockard at Opana Point," Lockard said. "We have a large unidentified formation inbound from the north, approximately 50 miles out, at least 50 aircraft, possibly more." Tyler thought for a moment. He knew that a flight of B-17 bombers was expected to arrive from California sometime that morning. He'd heard someone mention it at breakfast, and he assumed that's what Lockard was seeing. "Don't worry about it," Tyler said. Lockard was stunned. "Sir, this is a very large formation, definitely more than a dozen B-17s. Tyler's response would become one of the most infamous sentences in American military history. "It's probably nothing." Lockard tried once more. "Sir, I really think someone should investigate this contact. It's the largest formation I've ever tracked." "Don't worry about it," Tyler repeated, then hung up. Lockard put down the phone and looked at Elliott. "They told us not to worry about it." "What do we do?" Elliott asked. "We watch," Lockard said, "because something is very wrong." For the next 53 minutes, Joseph Lockard sat at his radar station and watched the largest aircraft formation he would ever see approach Oahu. Watched it close from 50 miles to 40 miles to 30 miles to 20, watched it split into multiple groups as it neared the island, watched it spread out across his radar screen in a pattern that looked exactly like an attack formation. And at 7:55, when the first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor and the Pacific Fleet began to die, Joseph Lockard was still sitting at his radar station watching it happen, knowing he had seen them coming and nobody had listened. If this story hits you, tap the like and subscribe now. Let's go back and understand who Joseph Lockard was, how he ended up on that radar station, and why the warning he gave died with one lieutenant's dismissal. Joseph Lockard was born on September 23, 1918, in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, a small town on the Susquehanna River where his father worked in a lumber mill and his mother raised 5 children in a 2-bedroom house. Joe, as everyone called him, was the second oldest child, quiet and studious, the kind of boy who took apart radios to understand how they worked and spent hours reading technical manuals from the public library. He graduated from Williamsport High School in 1936 during the Great Depression, when jobs were scarce and college was financially impossible for working-class families, so he worked at a hardware store for 2 years, saving money and trying to figure out what to do with his life. In 1938, at age 19, Lockard enlisted in the U.S. Army Signal Corps because the military offered steady pay, technical training, and the possibility of learning skills that would translate to civilian employment after his service ended. He went through basic training at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where the Signal Corps trained soldiers in radio communications, telephone systems, and the emerging field of radio detection and ranging, a technology the Army called radar. Radar was revolutionary technology in 1938, based on the principle that radio waves bounce off solid objects and return to their source, allowing operators to detect aircraft or ships at distances far beyond visual range. The British had developed the first practical radar systems in the mid-1930s, and the U.S. Army had been working to develop its own radar technology, creating mobile units that could be transported to forward positions and provide early warning of aircraft approaching defended areas. Lockard showed aptitude for the technical work, he understood radio theory, could troubleshoot electronic equipment, and had the patience required for the tedious work of monitoring radar screens for hours at a time. In 1939, the Army selected him for specialized training on the SCR-270 mobile radar system, a truck-mounted unit with a large rotating antenna that could detect aircraft at ranges up to 150 miles under ideal conditions. The SCR-270 was classified technology. Soldiers who trained on it signed secrecy agreements and were told that radar was a closely guarded military secret that could provide decisive advantage in any future war. Lockard spent 8 months learning how to operate, maintain, and interpret signals from the SCR-270, learning to distinguish between real aircraft contacts and false returns from weather, terrain, or equipment malfunction. In August 1940, Lockard received orders to deploy to Hawaii, where the Army was establishing a network of radar stations to provide early warning protection for Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet's main base. Hawaii seemed like paradise to a kid from Pennsylvania who'd never been more than 100 miles from home, warm weather, beaches, palm trees, and a duty assignment that involved sitting in an air-conditioned tent staring at a radar screen instead of marching through mud with a rifle. Lockard arrived at Schofield Barracks on Oahu in September 1940 and was assigned to the 515th Signal Aircraft Warning Service, a unit responsible for operating 5 mobile radar stations positioned around Oahu's coastline. His station was at Opana Point, a remote location on Oahu's northern coast, about 10 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a rough dirt road that wound through pineapple fields and sugar cane plantations. The radar station consisted of a large SE-270 radar unit mounted on a truck, a generator truck to provide power, and a canvas tent where operators sat in front of the oscilloscope screen and monitored for aircraft contacts. 2-man teams worked 4-hour shifts, one operator watching the screen while the other maintained the equipment and logged contacts. Shifts rotated so that the station was manned 24 hours a day, providing continuous coverage of the approaches to Oahu from the north. Lockard became one of the most experienced radar operators in the unit. He could identify aircraft at maximum range, could estimate formation size based on signal strength, could distinguish between different types of aircraft based on their radar signatures. He took the work seriously because he understood that radar was Oahu's first line of defense against any potential attack, that the minutes of warning provided by radar detection could mean the difference between scrambling interceptor aircraft to meet an attack or being caught with planes on the ground. By December 1941, Lockard had been operating radar for 15 months, had logged thousands of hours watching that green oscilloscope screen, had tracked hundreds of aircraft contacts from Navy patrol planes, Army bombers conducting training flights, and civilian aircraft flying between the Hawaiian Islands. He knew what normal looked like, knew the patterns of routine flight operations, knew the difference between a training mission and something unusual. And on the morning of December 7, 1941, What appeared on his radar screen was absolutely not normal. December 7, 1941, started as a routine Sunday morning at Opana Point. Lockard and his partner George Elliott arrived at the radar station at 4 in the morning to begin their shift, which was scheduled to run until 7. Sunday morning shifts were typically quiet. Most military units stood down on Sunday mornings, training flights were minimal, and the radar operators usually spent 4 hours watching an empty screen with only occasional contacts from Navy patrol aircraft. Lockard powered up the SER-270 radar unit, ran through the standard equipment checks, verified that the antenna was rotating properly and the oscilloscope was displaying correctly. Everything was functioning normally. He and Elliott settled into the routine of a Sunday morning shift. Elliott monitored the screen while Lockard maintained the logbook, recording each aircraft contact with its bearing, distance, and time of detection. Between 4 and 7 in the morning, they detected 6 contacts, all consistent with routine Navy patrol operations, single aircraft at various ranges and bearings, nothing unusual or unexpected. At 7 o'clock, their shift officially ended. Elliott prepared to shut down the radar station and head back to base for breakfast, but Lockard wanted to keep the station running for a few more minutes. The SE-270 required a lengthy shutdown procedure, powering down the transmitter, securing the antenna, disconnecting the power from the generator truck, and Lockard knew that a truck was supposed to arrive at 7:30 to transport them back to base. Instead of shutting down at 7 and then having to wait around for 30 minutes with nothing to do, Lockard suggested they keep the radar running and continue monitoring until the truck arrived. That way he could get additional practice reading the oscilloscope screen. Elliott agreed, so at 7 o'clock, when they should have powered down and packed up, they kept the radar station operating and continued watching for aircraft contacts. At 7:02, the largest radar return either of them had ever seen appeared on the oscilloscope screen. The signal was massive, a broad return that indicated multiple aircraft flying in close formation, the kind of signal strength that suggested at least 50 aircraft, possibly many more. Lockard immediately checked the radar settings to verify the equipment was functioning correctly, adjusted the gain control to ensure the signal wasn't an equipment malfunction, rotated the antenna to confirm the contact was real and not a ghost return from terrain or weather. Every check confirmed the same thing. The contact was real, the formation was large, and it was approximately 50 miles north of Oahu, heading directly toward the island at approximately 180 miles per hour. Lockard's first thought was that this must be a Navy formation returning from exercises, but 50 aircraft was larger than any Navy formation he'd ever tracked, and Navy operations usually didn't occur on Sunday mornings. His second thought was that this might be the flight of B-17 bombers expected to arrive from California, but B-17 flights typically consisted of a dozen aircraft at most, not 50, and they usually approached from the northeast, not due north. Whatever this formation was, it didn't match any known flight operations around Hawaii, and that meant someone needed to be notified immediately. Lockard picked up the phone and called the information center at Fort Shafter, the command post where all radar contacts were supposed to be reported so that air defense coordinators could identify aircraft and scramble interceptors if necessary. The information center was supposed to be fully staffed with radar plotters, identification officers, and duty officers who could make decisions about responding to unidentified aircraft, but on Sunday morning, December 7th, most of the staff had gone to breakfast, leaving only Private Joseph McDonald manning the phones. When Lockard reported the contact, McDonald didn't know what to do. He had no training in evaluating radar contacts, no authority to scramble interceptors, and no clear protocol for handling a report of 50 unidentified aircraft approaching Oahu. So he did what any confused private would do. He found an officer and passed the responsibility upward. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler was the duty officer that morning, and his response to Lockard's report would become one of the most controversial decisions in American military history. Tyler had been assigned to the information center for exactly 1 week. He was a pilot with no training in air defense operations, no experience with radar, and no understanding of what radar operators were actually telling him when they reported contacts. When he took the phone from McDonald and listened to Lockard describe a formation of 50-plus aircraft inbound from the north, Tyler made a series of assumptions that seemed reasonable at the moment but proved catastrophically wrong. He assumed the contact was the B-17 flight from California. He'd heard someone mention at breakfast that B-17s were arriving that morning, and in his mind, that explained the radar contact. He didn't consider that B-17 flights were much smaller than 50 aircraft, didn't consider that they approached from a different direction, didn't consider that Lockard, an experienced radar operator, wouldn't have called in a routine B-17 flight as an emergency contact. Tyler simply assumed that everything was normal, that Lockard was reporting routine traffic, and that no action was necessary. "Don't worry about it," he told Lockard, then hung up. Lockard sat at his radar station staring at the phone, trying to process what had just happened. He had reported the largest radar contact he'd ever seen, had emphasized that this was unusual and needed investigation, and had been dismissed with a sentence that seemed designed to end the conversation as quickly as possible. He looked at Elliot and said, "They told us not to worry about it." Elliot, who was less experienced and more inclined to trust that officers knew what they were doing, suggested they should shut down the radar and wait for their ride back to base. But Lockard couldn't let it go. Something felt wrong. The formation was too large, the approach vector was too direct, and Tyler's dismissive response didn't match the urgency of what Lockard was seeing on his screen. "We're keeping the radar running," Lockard said. "I want to track this formation until it reaches Oahu." So they watched. For the next 53 minutes, Lockard and Elliot sat at their radar station and tracked the formation as it approached Oahu, watching it close from 50 miles to 40 miles to 30 miles. At 44 miles, Lockard noticed the formation was maintaining a precise heading directly toward Pearl Harbor, not the typical meandering path of a ferry flight or training mission. At 39 miles, he noticed the formation was maintaining exactly 180 miles per hour, a speed consistent with combat aircraft in cruise configuration, not the faster speeds typical of bomber ferry flights. At 32 miles, the formation began to split, with smaller groups breaking off to different headings, a pattern consistent with an attack formation where fighters separate to strafe different targets while bombers maintain course to their primary objective. At 22 miles, Lockard completely lost the formation signal as the aircraft descended below the radar's coverage area, flying low to avoid detection, another indicator that this was not routine flight operations. By then it was 7:55 in the morning, and the first Japanese bombs were already falling on Pearl Harbor. Lockard and Elliot heard the explosions before they understood what was happening, dull crumps echoing from the direction of Pearl Harbor, too heavy and too frequent to be training exercises or construction blasting. Then they saw the smoke, black columns rising from the direction of Pearl Harbor Naval Station, visible even from their position 10 miles away on Oahu's northern coast. Elliot ran outside the tent and looked south toward Pearl Harbor. His first words were, "That can't be what I think it is." But Lockard knew exactly what it was. He'd been tracking that formation for 53 minutes, had watched it approach with the precision and intent of an attack force, had tried to warn someone and been dismissed. Now he was watching Pearl Harbor burn and understanding with terrible clarity that the aircraft he detected at 7:02 were Japanese, that they had attacked exactly as his radar had shown them approaching, and that his warning had been ignored. The attack lasted 1 hour and 15 minutes. Japanese aircraft struck in two waves, the first wave at 7:55 consisting of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters that attacked Battleship Row, the airfields, and shore installations. The second wave at 8:54 consisted of additional dive bombers and high-altitude bombers that targeted ships that survived the first wave and attempted to strafe aircraft and facilities that hadn't been destroyed yet. From Opana Point, Lockard and Elliot could see the smoke and hear the explosions but couldn't see the actual attack. They were too far away and the terrain blocked direct line of sight to Pearl Harbor. What they could do was listen to radio traffic from Army and Navy units responding to the attack, frantic calls for air support, damage reports from ships, calls for medical assistance, and the repeated message that stunned everyone who heard it: "Air raid Pearl Harbor, this is no drill." Lockard sat at his radar station feeling physically sick. He'd seen them coming, had provided 53 minutes of warning, enough time to scramble every fighter on Oahu, enough time to alert anti-aircraft batteries, enough time to prepare ships for attack. Instead, the entire Pacific Fleet had been caught completely by surprise. Battleships were sinking in Pearl Harbor, aircraft were being destroyed on the ground, and men were dying because one lieutenant had decided that the largest radar contact in Hawaii's history was probably nothing. At 9 o'clock, a staff car arrived at Opana Point carrying an Army captain who ordered Lockard and Elliott to immediately report to Fort Shafter for debriefing. The captain's exact words were, "You two need to explain what the hell you saw this morning and why nobody knew about it." Lockard and Elliott drove to Fort Shafter in silence, neither of them knowing what to say, neither of them fully processing the magnitude of what had happened. When they arrived at Fort Shafter, the base was in chaos, smoke from Pearl Harbor visible from every vantage point, ambulances racing past carrying wounded from the harbor, and officers shouting orders as the Army tried to organize a defense against a possible second attack or Japanese invasion. Lockard and Elliott were taken directly to headquarters and questioned by multiple officers about the radar contact they detected at 7:02. What exactly had they seen? What did they report? Who did they talk to? Why wasn't the alert passed up the chain of command? Lockard explained everything methodically: the massive radar return at 7:02, the phone call to the information center, his conversation with Lieutenant Tyler, the dismissal with, "Don't worry about it," and the 53 minutes he'd spent tracking the formation until it descended and disappeared from his radar screen. The officers questioned him aggressively. "Are you certain the equipment was working correctly? Could this have been a malfunction? Are you positive it was 50 aircraft and not 5? Did you emphasize to Lieutenant Tyler that this was an unusual contact?" Lockard answered every question with increasing frustration. Yes, the equipment was functioning correctly. Yes, he was certain it was a massive formation. Yes, he had told Tyler this was unusual and needed investigation. One officer asked the question that would haunt Lockard for the rest of his life. "If you believed this contact was important enough to keep tracking for 53 minutes, why didn't you call the information center again after Lieutenant Tyler dismissed you?" Lockard had no good answer. He was a private. Tyler was a lieutenant. Military protocol was that privates didn't question officers' decisions, didn't call back after being told not to worry, didn't override the chain of command. He'd done what he was trained to do, reported the contact, deferred to the officer's judgment, and assumed that Tyler had information or context that explained why 50 aircraft approaching Hawaii wasn't worth investigating. Except Tyler hadn't had information or context. Tyler had made an assumption based on incomplete knowledge and confirmation bias, had heard what he expected to hear rather than what Lockard was actually telling him, and had dismissed the most important radar contact in American military history with 4 words. The debriefing ended with instructions that Lockard and Elliott were to write detailed reports of everything they observed and report back for additional questioning the following day. Lockard returned to his barracks that evening and tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes he saw that radar screen at 7:02, saw the massive contact approaching from the north, saw 53 minutes when he knew disaster was coming and couldn't make anyone listen. Over the next 3 days, as the full scope of the Pearl Harbor attack became clear, the numbers were almost incomprehensible. 2,403 Americans killed, 1,178 wounded, 8 battleships sunk or damaged, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, the Pacific Fleet crippled. And Joseph Lockard knew that he'd seen the attackers coming with 53 minutes of warning, enough time to change everything, enough time to save thousands of lives, if only someone had listened. The investigation into how Pearl Harbor happened began within hours of the attack. Military and civilian authorities needed to understand how the Japanese had achieved complete tactical surprise despite the presence of radar, intelligence assets, and defensive preparations. Joseph Lockard found himself at the center of 3 separate investigations: the Army's immediate inquiry into why the radar warning wasn't acted upon, the Roberts Commission appointed by President Roosevelt to investigate the Pearl Harbor attack, and the Joint Congressional Committee that conducted hearings in 1945 to 1946. The first investigation began on December 8 when Lockard was called to Fort Shafter to meet with a board of officers examining the radar detection and the information center's response. Lockard provided his account again: the massive radar contact at 7:02, the phone call reporting it, Lieutenant Tyler's dismissal, the 53 minutes of tracking. The board questioned Lieutenant Tyler separately, and his testimony revealed the cascade of assumptions and miscommunications that had led to the warning being dismissed. Tyler explained that he'd been assigned to the information center for exactly 7 days, had received minimal training, and had never been told what specific procedures to follow when radar stations reported unusual contacts. He'd assumed the radar contact was the B-17 flight from California because someone had mentioned at breakfast that B-17s were expected that morning. He hadn't considered that the direction, size, or behavior of the contact didn't match B-17 ferry operations. Most critically, Tyler admitted he didn't understand the significance of what Lockard was telling him, didn't grasp that experienced radar operators don't call in routine contacts as emergency reports, didn't recognize that when a radar operator says, "This is unusual," it means something genuinely unusual is happening. The board's findings were devastating. The radar warning system had functioned exactly as designed. The operators had detected the Japanese formation at maximum range and reported it immediately, but command structure failures and inadequate training had prevented the warning from reaching anyone who could have acted on it. Lockard was cleared of any responsibility. The board found that he had performed his duties correctly and that the failure lay with the information center's inadequate staffing and Lieutenant Tyler's lack of training. Tyler wasn't court-martialed but was reassigned to other duties and carried the stigma of being the officer who dismissed the Pearl Harbor warning for the rest of his military career. But for Lockard, being cleared of responsibility didn't erase the weight of knowing what might have been. 53 minutes was enough time to scramble every P-40 fighter on Oahu. Enough time to alert anti-aircraft batteries. Enough time to get ships' crews to battle stations. The Japanese attack might still have succeeded, might still have damaged ships and caused casualties, but the surprise would have been eliminated, defenses would have been prepared, and the catastrophic losses might have been reduced. In January 1942, Lockard was called to testify before the Roberts Commission, a presidential commission investigating the Pearl Harbor attack to determine accountability and recommend changes to prevent future failures. The commission, chaired by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts, interviewed hundreds of witnesses including senior commanders, intelligence officers, and radar operators. Lockard's testimony was brief but powerful. He described the radar detection, the phone call, the dismissal, and then answered questions from commission members about radar capabilities and limitations. One commissioner asked him directly, "In your professional opinion as a radar operator, was the contact you detected at 7:02 consistent with a large-scale attack formation?" Lockard answered honestly, "Yes, sir, everything about that contact suggested hostile intent, the size, the bearing, the speed, the direct approach to Oahu. I believed then and I believe now that it was the Japanese attack force." Another commissioner asked, "If Lieutenant Tyler had ordered you to continue tracking and had alerted air defense commands, do you believe the attack could have been stopped?" Lockard chose his words carefully. "I can't say the attack could have been stopped, but I believe our forces would have been prepared and the losses would have been significantly reduced." The Roberts Commission's report, published in January 1942, concluded that the commanders at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, had failed to properly prepare defenses despite receiving warnings that war with Japan was imminent. The report mentioned the radar detection briefly, noting that warning systems had functioned but that inadequate procedures had prevented the warning from being acted upon, but the report focused primarily on command failures rather than the specific breakdown that had occurred at the information center. Lockard returned to duty, was promoted to sergeant, and spent the rest of 1942 training radar operators at bases throughout the United States, teaching new operators how to interpret radar contacts and, critically, how to communicate effectively with command centers when reporting unusual activity. The Army had learned from Pearl Harbor. New procedures were implemented requiring duty officers at information centers to have extensive training in radar operations, requiring all unusual contacts to be investigated regardless of whether they seemed to match expected traffic, requiring radar operators to persist in reporting contacts they believed were significant even if initially dismissed. But personal lessons were different from institutional lessons, and the personal lesson Joseph Lockard learned was that being right didn't matter if you couldn't make people listen, that data was worthless if authority dismissed it, that expertise meant nothing if rank and hierarchy determined whose judgment was trusted. In 1945, as the war in the Pacific was ending, Congress convened a joint committee to conduct comprehensive hearings on the Pearl Harbor attack, interviewing hundreds of witnesses and reviewing thousands of documents. Lockard was called to testify again, for years after the attack, and found himself reliving that morning one more time in front of senators and representatives who wanted to understand how America had been caught unprepared. His testimony lasted 3 hours. He described the radar detection in minute detail, described the phone conversation with Lieutenant Tyler word for word as he remembered it, and described the 53 minutes of tracking the Japanese formation while knowing something terrible was about to happen. The committee's questions were pointed. Did you consider calling back after Lieutenant Tyler dismissed your report? Lockard's answer was the same as it had been in every previous investigation. No, sir, I was a private. Lieutenant Tyler was an officer. Military protocol was that I reported the contact and deferred to his judgment. I didn't have authority to override an officer's decision. One senator pressed harder. But you were the expert on radar. You knew something was wrong. Didn't you have an obligation to keep trying to warn someone? Lockard's response was quiet but devastating. Sir, I tried to warn someone. I called the information center. I spoke to a duty officer. I emphasized that this was unusual. I was told not to worry about it. What else should I have done? The senator had no answer, because the fundamental problem wasn't what Lockard should have done. The problem was a system where expertise was subordinate to rank, where a private who knew disaster was coming couldn't override a lieutenant who didn't understand what he was being told. The congressional hearings concluded in 1946 with a massive report that spread blame across multiple levels of command, criticized intelligence failures, communication breakdowns, and inadequate defensive preparations, but ultimately concluded that Pearl Harbor had been a failure of imagination more than a failure of intelligence. Lockard's radar detection was noted as evidence that technical systems had worked correctly, but human systems had failed to process the information those technical systems provided. For Joseph Lockard, the investigations meant reliving the worst morning of his life 5 separate times over 5 years, meant answering the same questions repeatedly, meant carrying the weight of knowing that 53 minutes of warning had been wasted because one officer said, "Don't worry about it." Joseph Lockard served in the Army Signal Corps until 1945. He spent most of the war training radar operators, passing on the lessons learned from December 7th to thousands of young soldiers who would operate radar stations throughout the Pacific Theater. He taught them technical skills but also taught them something more important: the courage to trust their expertise, the importance of persisting when reporting unusual contacts, the necessity of making authorities understand the significance of what they were seeing. Every class of radar operators Lockard trained heard the story of Opana Point, heard how he detected the Pearl Harbor attack 53 minutes before it happened, heard how his warning had been dismissed, heard how that dismissal had cost thousands of lives. And every operator learned the lesson that Lockard had paid for. When you see something unusual, when your expertise tells you something is wrong, you keep reporting it until someone listens. You don't accept dismissal from officers who don't understand what you're telling them. You persist because lives depend on the warning getting through. Lockard was discharged from the Army in October 1945 with the rank of Master Sergeant. He returned to Pennsylvania and used his GI Bill benefits to attend Penn State University, graduating in 1949 with a degree in electrical engineering. He worked for RCA for 33 years, designing radar and communication systems for military and civilian applications. He became a recognized expert in radar technology and contributed to systems that evolved from the primitive SEA-270 he'd operated at Opana Point into sophisticated air defense networks. He married in 1947, had 4 children, lived a quiet suburban life in New Jersey, and rarely spoke about Pearl Harbor except when asked directly. His family knew he'd been there, knew he'd operated radar on December 7th, but didn't know the details of what he'd seen or what he'd tried to do. Lockard didn't talk about it because talking meant reliving it, meant thinking about 53 minutes of warning that hadn't mattered. In December 1966, on the 25th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, a journalist from the New York Times tracked Lockard down and interviewed him about his role in detecting the Japanese attack. The resulting article, published on December 7, 1966, told Lockard's story in detail for the first time in a major publication, described the radar contact, the phone call, the dismissal, the 53 minutes of watching disaster approach. The article generated significant public interest. Other journalists contacted Lockard, veterans organizations invited him to speak, and for the first time since the war ended, people outside military circles learned about the radar operator who'd seen Pearl Harbor coming and couldn't make anyone listen. Lockard gave a few interviews, appeared at a Pearl Harbor survivors gathering in Hawaii in 1971, but mostly he remained private, uncomfortable with being treated as a historical figure when he saw himself as someone who'd simply done his job and been ignored. In a 1976 interview with an oral history project at the Army Signal Corps Museum, Lockard reflected on December 7th with the perspective of 35 years. "I did everything I was supposed to do. I detected the formation, I reported it immediately, I emphasized it was unusual, I even continued tracking it after my shift ended because something felt wrong. But none of that mattered because the person I reported to didn't understand what I was telling him." That's the fundamental lesson of Pearl Harbor. It's not enough to have good intelligence if the people receiving that intelligence don't recognize its significance. The interviewer asked Lockard if he felt anger toward Lieutenant Tyler for dismissing his warning. Lockard's answer was surprisingly compassionate. Tyler wasn't trained for that position, he'd been there a week, he didn't understand radar, he didn't know what questions to ask, he made assumptions that seemed reasonable at the time but proved wrong. "I don't blame Tyler personally, I blame the system that put an untrained officer in a critical position and then gave him no guidance on how to handle unusual situations." What Lockard didn't say in that interview but said privately to family members was that he blamed himself for not doing more, for not calling back, for not finding another officer, for not driving to Fort Shafter personally and making someone understand that disaster was approaching. Rationally, he knew those thoughts were unfair. He'd been a 23-year-old private with no authority to override officers or bypass chain of command. He'd done everything military protocol required him to do. But emotionally, he carried the weight of 53 minutes when he could see what was coming and couldn't stop it, 53 minutes when the future was visible on a radar screen and nobody believed it. Joseph Lockard died on January 28, 1987, at age 68 from heart failure. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with military honors. His obituary in the New York Times remembered him as the radar operator who detected the Pearl Harbor attack but couldn't make authorities listen. His gravestone carries his name, rank, dates of service, and one line that he requested himself. Opana Point, December 7, 1941, 0702 hours. The numbers meant something only to people who understood the story. 7:02 was the exact moment he detected the Japanese formation, the moment when warning was possible, the moment when 53 minutes of advance notice began ticking away toward nothing. The story of Joseph Lockard and the radar detection that didn't stop Pearl Harbor teaches lessons that extend far beyond one morning in Hawaii. It's a story about the friction between expertise and hierarchy, about technical systems that work correctly but institutional systems that fail to process the information those technical systems provide. It's about the dangers of confirmation bias, the tendency to hear what we expect to hear rather than what people are actually telling us. Lieutenant Tyler expected routine traffic, so when Lockard reported unusual traffic, Tyler's brain converted unusual into routine and dismissed it. It's about the consequences of inadequate training. Tyler wasn't incompetent, he was untrained, placed in a position requiring expertise he didn't possess and given no guidance on how to handle situations outside his experience. It's about the importance of procedural redundancy. A system where one person's dismissal can kill a warning is a fragile system. Robust systems require multiple checkpoints, require warnings to reach multiple decision-makers, require persistence mechanisms that prevent critical information from being discarded by a single gatekeeper. But most fundamentally, it's about the burden carried by people who see disaster coming and can't make others believe them, the special kind of helplessness that comes from having knowledge, expertise, and data that prove something terrible is about to happen, and being powerless to act because authority dismisses that knowledge as probably nothing. That burden didn't end with Pearl Harbor, it repeated throughout World War II and every conflict since. Intelligence analysts who predicted enemy actions but weren't believed, reconnaissance pilots who reported enemy movements but were dismissed, radar operators who tracked incoming attacks but couldn't get interceptors scrambled in time. It repeats in civilian life, engineers who warn that systems are unsafe but are overruled by managers focused on cost, scientists who predict disasters but are ignored by politicians prioritizing short-term interests, experts of every kind who possess knowledge that could prevent tragedy but can't penetrate the barriers of hierarchy, bureaucracy, and disbelief. The specific lesson of Pearl Harbor, the lesson that Joseph Lockard paid for and that the military learned in blood, was that warning systems are only as good as the procedures for acting on warnings. that detecting threats is pointless if detection doesn't translate into response. After Pearl Harbor, the military completely rebuilt its air defense command structures. Radar reports were routed to multiple command centers simultaneously. Duty officers were required to have extensive training in air defense operations. Unusual contacts were automatically escalated to senior commanders, and radar operators were explicitly authorized to persist in reporting contacts they believed were significant even if initially dismissed. These changes came too late for the 2,403 Americans who died on December 7th, too late for the battleships that sank in Pearl Harbor, too late for the aircraft destroyed on the ground, but they prevented similar surprises throughout the rest of the war. Japanese attempts to launch surprise attacks on other Pacific bases were detected and countered because radar operators remembered Lockard's story and refused to let warnings be dismissed, because duty officers remembered the cost of saying, "probably nothing," when "probably" meant catastrophic failure if wrong. The broader cultural lesson took longer to learn and is still being relearned with each new crisis. The lesson that expertise matters, that people with technical knowledge and direct observation of events know things that authorities don't know, that hierarchies designed to maintain order and discipline can also kill necessary warnings if they prevent information from flowing upward. Modern military doctrine now explicitly addresses this problem. Junior personnel are trained to persist in reporting unusual observations. Chain of command includes bypass procedures for emergency warnings, and commanders are trained to listen to technical experts even when those experts are outranked. But the same problem persists in civilian institutions, corporations where engineers' safety warnings are dismissed by executives prioritizing profits, government agencies where analysts' intelligence assessments are ignored by officials pursuing predetermined policies, medical systems where nurses' clinical observations are overridden by protocols designed for different situations. Every field has its version of Joseph Lockard, the person with expertise who sees disaster coming and can't make authority listen, who reports the warning clearly and correctly and is told, "Don't worry about it," by someone who doesn't understand what they're being told. And every field eventually learns the same lesson Pearl Harbor taught, that ignoring expert warnings because they're inconvenient, or because they come from low-ranking sources, or because they challenge assumptions, eventually costs lives and forces institutional changes that should have been made before people died. Joseph Lockard's 53 minutes of watching disaster approach while knowing he'd tried to warn someone and been dismissed became a permanent reminder that in any system designed to respond to threats, the hardest problem isn't detecting the threat, it's making people believe detection when belief requires accepting that comfortable assumptions are wrong. On December 7, 1991, the 50th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack, a memorial ceremony was held at Oahu Point, the site where Joseph Lockard had detected the Japanese formation 50 years earlier. The SCA-270 radar station was long gone, replaced by modern air defense systems that could track hundreds of aircraft simultaneously at ranges extending hundreds of miles, but the location remained significant as the place where warning had been given and dismissed. Veterans of Pearl Harbor attended, along with military historians, Signal Corps personnel, and Joseph Lockard's family, his wife Helen, his 4 children, and 7 grandchildren who'd heard their grandfather's story but were seeing the actual place for the first time. A plaque was unveiled commemorating the radar detection. At this location on December 7, 1941, at 0702 hours, Private Joseph Lockard detected the approaching Japanese attack formation, providing 53 minutes of warning. His dedication to duty and persistence in reporting unusual activity exemplifies the highest standards of the United States Army Signal Corps. One of Lockard's sons, James Lockard, spoke briefly at the ceremony. He said something that captured his father's lifelong feeling about Pearl Harbor. "My father never considered himself a hero. He considered himself someone who tried to do his job correctly and was prevented from completing that job by systems that weren't designed to handle the information he was providing. He hoped that by teaching other radar operators to persist in reporting unusual contacts, by making sure his experience became institutional knowledge rather than personal tragedy, he could prevent other people from experiencing what he experienced. Watching disaster happen while knowing you tried to warn someone and it didn't matter." The ceremony ended, the veterans dispersed, and the Lockard family stood at Opana Point looking north across the Pacific Ocean toward the direction from which the Japanese formation had approached 50 years earlier. They tried to imagine what Joseph had seen on that radar screen at 7:02, tried to imagine the size and significance of that contact, tried to imagine the growing sense of alarm as the formation continued to approach and no response materialized. Tried to imagine 53 minutes of watching catastrophe unfold in slow motion while being powerless to stop it. That particular burden, the burden of being right at the worst possible moment, of having knowledge that could save lives but being unable to translate that knowledge into action, of watching tragedy happen while knowing you tried to prevent it and failed, that burden defined Joseph Lockard's life more than any of his accomplishments in radar technology or electrical engineering. He carried it for 46 years, from December 7, 1941, until his death in January 1987, carried it with dignity and quiet pain, rarely spoke about it but never forgot it. And his story stands as permanent reminder that in any system designed to protect people, the most critical component isn't the technology that detects threats, it's the human systems that decide whether to believe those detections and act on them. Joseph Lockard's radar worked perfectly, detected the Japanese formation at maximum range, provided 53 minutes of advance warning, but the human system failed because one undertrained officer made an assumption that seemed reasonable but proved catastrophically wrong. And 2,403 Americans died because, probably nothing, was easier to believe than accepting that Pearl Harbor was about to be attacked on a peaceful Sunday morning.